All right, well, I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Julian Maxwell Hayter, Associate Professor of Leadership Studies at the University of Richmond. Dr. Hayter is the author of The Dream Lost, Voting Rights and the Politics of Race in Richmond, Virginia. He's one of the nation's foremost authorities on the history of Richmond. Today, we're going to talk about how Richmond was made, how housing politics shaped the geography of the city, and particularly its patterns of residential segregation. Welcome, Dr. Hayter. Just to get started, can you talk a little bit about the development of the Black community in Richmond in the 19th century, and particularly the emergence of Jackson Ward as a center of Black residents?
Sure. So, even during slavery, Richmond is an unique case in that it was one of the few industrialized centers in the South, which meant that slaves often worked in an industrial capacity near waterways. And before the electrification of cities, that meant that slaves often had to live near the point of production, and in tobacco, pig iron, flour. There were any number of these slaves who worked in this capacity or these capacities that did not live with their owners. So they were able to kind of build these quasi-free communities in Richmond and around Chaco Bottom and Church Hill. And then over time, we begin to see the growth of a neighborhood that becomes Jackson Ward in the mid-19th century, that is both made up of free and enslaved Africans. And what we begin to see is that really sets the tone for what Richmond becomes after the Civil War. So these quasi-free, enslaved, and free communities set the tempo for Black neighborhoods that emerged during Jim Crow segregation. Point being, there were already African-American communities in the city of Richmond during slavery. And that, I think, sets a kind of unique tempo that allows for these thriving communities that emerge after the Civil War to move into the 20th century.
One of the things that's interesting about that dynamic in the 19th century, right, is that the Jackson Ward is created in 1871 as a political device to gerrymander or to sort of concentrate Black political power, sort of isolated in one part of the city. And then it becomes, of course, a center for Black political power at the same time. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that dynamic.
Yeah, I think one of the things we have to keep in mind when we talk about the emergence of African-American communities after emancipation is it belies, in many ways, the ways that we think about what slavery did and did not do, right, to African-Americans collectively and individually, right? On the one hand, of course, right, there's generational trauma from slavery and the brutalities of that system. However, if you look at the emergence of African-American communities after the Civil War in the South, it is abundantly clear that that slaves are allowed to build communities and build their own communities that are the rival of their white counterparts. So what we begin to see, in some cases, a decade or a matter of years, we begin to see communities emerge, cities within cities, self-contained communities that turn inward. And Jackson Ward being one of those communities, and it scares the white power structure. So Jackson Ward is actually kind of a political ruse to neutralize the growing power of an African-American community that's being compressed into certain areas, right? The implicit gamble, by the way, of segregation is that compressing African-Americans into particular communities actually concentrates their political power. So Jackson Ward is created in some ways to neutralize the growing political power of African-Americans in these segregated spaces that emerge almost immediately after the Civil War, that in many ways are the rival of their white counterparts, that are self-sustaining, and in some cases, and in many cases, thriving.
Yeah, I think that's a story that isn't very well known, which is just the existence of significant Black political power after the Civil War. Can you talk a little bit more?
That's right. Because we look through the 20th century, right? And the 20th century has a tendency to kind of distort our gaze, right? Because what we see are the results of of the kind of breaking apart of those thriving communities, which isn't, and then, so it's hard for us to understand what was there before what emerges in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s. And what emerged after the Civil War were African Americans who had the skills to build their own communities, much like any other. I almost have to think of it this way. African American communities in the 19th century, in some ways, is an immigrant story. It's a story of people who are recently freed, who are trying to do the same thing that every other immigrant community has done in coming to the United States. And that's build a new life for themselves. The problem is that, and we've seen this repeatedly throughout American history, when African Americans begin to do well, it often piques white anxiety. So what we see are these communities are met by the forces of restriction who first, embark on vigilantism and extra institutional ways to try to control the thriving nature of these spaces. And then they just reorganize the nature of government to systematically disinvest the communities of the building blocks of upward mobility, right? But they are thriving at one point. And in some cases, they continue to thrive despite the fact that they are being systematically torn apart by the vestiges of power. Right. So you'd see banks, you would see mutual benefit societies, insurance companies, the things that any other community had before the nanny state emerges in the 1930s. All immigrant communities rely on one another, rely on themselves, right? There are no federal programs to help vulnerable communities in the United States until the 1930s and 40s, not in any measurable or decent way. So what communities do before the 1930s and the 1940s is they create the apparatus necessary to ensure that their communities can meet contemporary challenges, and African Americans do the same thing. The difference between African Americans and other immigrant communities is they're up against a different brand of resistance than their white
counterparts. The other difference, especially if you're talking about the Irish, Italians, is the vote, right? So. And political power really matters in the defense and the maintenance of those communities, right? So in 1902, the Constitution strictly curtails Black voting power. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how political disenfranchisement sets the stage for subsequent developments in the city.
Right. So everybody back then, and even people now, know that the vote, especially on the local level, is a measure of community control. Right. It's a way to protect your communities from, the contingencies of life. Right. That's what political power and a representative democracy is. So what, the forces of restriction do, what segregationists do in 1901 and 1982 is they create this happens, by the way, throughout the South at the turn of the last century, where you begin to see the forces of Jim Crow segregation reorganizing government in a kind of oligarchic manner to meet the demands of a handful of landed individuals. So in Virginia, this manifests as the Constitutional Convention of 1901 and 1902, which is specifically convened to disenfranchise African Americans. And I've said this before, right? They said as much, by the way. Carter Glass and the people who organized this were explicit about what they were doing, right? And so with the stroke of a pen, they had effectively disenfranchised 80% of African Americans of the right to vote in 1902. But the dirty little secret is that it also disenfranchises 50% of whites. Virginia has one of the lowest voter turnout rates of any free democracy in the world for most of the early 20th century, and the lowest voter turnout rate of any state in the former Confederacy for most of the 20th century. It's scandalous. You can't look at it in any other way as a kind of serfdom is what they're doing. In disallowing people to participate in the political process, they are establishing a kind of aristocratic oligarchy that has control over state politics in the Commonwealth for a sizable portion of the 20th century. A handful of people who are perpetually fearful of democracy are responsible for making the decisions in the Commonwealth.
Can you talk about that dynamic a little bit more? I mean, so Michelle Alexander calls this the propensity in certain moments for working class or poor white people to align with their sort of racial interest rather than their class interest. Right? Michelle Alexander calls it a racial bribe. David Roediger talks about the wages of whiteness. Can you talk about that dynamic of, because this, you're right, this happens again and again, which is that policies which are made popular or pushed through on the basis of disenfranchising or disempowering Black communities have the benefit, have the result of really putting white communities in a difficult position, whether it's politically, whether it's economically as well. And in these crucial moments, it is white voters that are, or white people that are supporting these measures.
Let me break this down, I think, in ways that anybody can understand. We think of Jim Crow almost through the lens of Black and white exclusively. That, and it is that, right? It is a way for not only the progeny of slaveholders, but this new emerging wealth in the South from industrialization that had been some way staved off because of the kind of agrarian nature of the slave system begins to emerge. And people are making a lot of money. And it's the people who are beginning to make a lot of money in the late 19th and the 20th century that reorganized government to benefit themselves at the expense of African Americans. On some level, you have to think about Jim Crow. I mean, we think about Jim Crow in the most benign ways sometimes. It's like lunch counters and segregated dining rooms. Really what it's about is reorganization of the Black labor force, right? Well, who else suffers from that but white people, right? And that's what the disenfranchisement of 50% of white folks does in the Commonwealth, is it allows only a handful of, let me take you back to the Revolutionary. If you know who could vote during the Revolutionary, a person who had 20 pounds of tobacco. Well, who would have 20 pounds of tobacco other than a slave owner? This place has always been perpetually fearful of, that's the irony of Virginia, the home of 5 presidents, right? But if you actually look at the historical narrative, instead of mythologizing about the past, Virginia has always had and continues to have in some ways a limited vision of democracy. And we begin to see that emerge in the early 20th century with the Constitutional Convention of 1901 and 1902, when a handful of wealthy white individuals are stripping the entire Commonwealth of the right to vote, not just African Americans. And to be perfectly honest with you, everyone suffers. People in Appalachia suffer as much as people in Jackson Ward suffer. The problem is somehow race is able to stitch white people together in this loose constituency, even though the political system is actually designed to hurt white people too.
Yeah. So is that fear? Like what is at the root? I mean, like I'm thinking about the Danville massacre, right? Or sort of the rise and fall of the Readjuster Party, right? Like a party that brought together poor white people.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, right? There's this brief moment in Virginia's political history of interracialism, where they are able to take over the General Assembly for the greater good of the Commonwealth. They build the framework for the public school system, and they're actually trying to come to terms with the kind of flagging effects of the slave system. And it's an interracial organization led by a former Confederate, no less, who decide to hedge their bets against an old oligarchy by creating an interracial political union. And it scares the shit, right, excuse my language, out of the landed gentry. And what they do is they spend the better portion of the late 19th century drumming up racial controversy to make sure that this never happens again. And it works, by the way. So what we see over the course of the first 60 years of the 20th century is that people who are pretty much in the same economic situation, right, can't see beyond their racial differences. And this resonates beyond. Bacon's Rebellion was chock full of these implications. This comes up in Virginia over and over and over again, where whites and African Americans cannot get past their differences when it comes to race. And it allows a handful of people to control the political system.